So the first thing we need to talk about is the fact that the type of dominance that Mendel talked about the most was called complete dominance, but it's really not that common to have total complete dominance of something. Okay, there's actually a range of dominance, right? Ranges of dominance. Okay, so there's complete dominance. This does happen sometimes. And the way that we define complete dominance is that we say that if you looked at an individual that had the homozygous dominant genotype, that individual would have the exact same phenotype as the heterozygote. Okay, so the homozygous dominant has the same phenotype as the heterozygote. Okay, so it is for this reason that we see things like recessive diseases that people can be carriers of. Okay, there's an example in the book of cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is essentially the inability to transport chloride ions across the plasma membrane because the channel protein that would normally do it is misshapen. And the reason why it's misshapen is because there's been some mutations in the gene that would normally produce it, and so it doesn't produce the correct shape of channel protein, right? So this is a recessive disorder. Okay? But it's a recessive disorder that's actually really common. And the reason why it's common is because it's really common for people to be carriers of it. Okay? Carriers have one copy of a diseased allele or a messed up allele, but they don't exhibit any symptoms. Okay? So one copy of a bad allele, but do not show symptoms. Okay? So, the carriers, it's about 1 in 20 of all Caucasians are carriers for cystic fibrosis. And so they could have the genotype, let's say cystic fibrosis or chloride ion channel, whatever, big C, normal, little c, diseased, right? So they're saying, okay, I have this dominant trait for the normal chloride ion channel, and then I have this recessive trait for the diseased chloride ion channel. And the only way that the offspring is ever going to have cystic fibrosis is if they inherit 2 of the diseased chloride ion channels, right? Because this person is a carrier, meaning that they are not showing symptoms. This is what I mean by complete dominance. You cannot tell the difference between a person who has 2 copies of the normal allele and a person who has 1 copy of the normal allele. They're exhibiting the exact same phenotype. Okay? There's also something that's called incomplete dominance. Yeah.
Is that second C supposed to be smaller?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, incomplete dominance. Incomplete dominance means that the organism that is homozygous dominant will have a more extreme phenotype than the organism that is a heterozygote. Homozygous dominant has a more extreme phenotype than the heterozygote. Okay? And this happens because the homozygous dominant produces twice as much of that protein. Homozygous dominant produces twice as much of the protein. Okay, so the example of this is the pink flowers. Okay, so if you took a white flower, and the white flower, let's say that this is pigment here, and they have pigment, white, like that. Okay, and you crossed it with a red flower. That would be pigment red. The resulting offspring would then be pink, because they are going to have one pigment white and one pigment red. Right? And if you think about it, they are producing this red pigment, and if they are producing 2 times as much because they're homozygous dominant, that means that they're going to be really red. If they're producing half as much, they're going to be just a little red. And it happens to be that just a little red is pink. Right? So this totally explains the blending hypothesis. Remember how Mendel was like, hey guys, if you look at the F2 generation though, I actually get some white flowers back and some red flowers back. And that's because when you cross a organism like this that's heterozygous, that means that you're going to get one organism that's going to be homozygous dominant, one organism that is homozygous recessive, and 2 organisms that are heterozygotes from that cross. And so that's the 50% pink, 25% white, 25% red that we see in that cross.
So like, oh, so the pink is the heterozygous.
Yep, pink is the heterozygote. Yep. Okay, so that's incomplete dominance. There's also something called codominance. Codominance is when there are 2 completely dominant alleles that are both expressed at the same time. Two completely dominant alleles, both expressed at the same time. Okay, so if both of them are expressed at the same time, that would be like the ABO blood group. Okay, there are 3 possible alleles for blood type, right? They're all denoted with an I. That I is showing what's something called an immunoglobulin. It basically just means that your body is responding to an antigen that's on, we haven't heard that term either. Your body is responding to a protein that's on the surface of the blood cell, right? And so there's this A antigen, this A protein, right? There's a B protein, and then there's another gene that makes you produce no protein there, okay? And so that's recessive, and sometimes it's recessive with a O, and sometimes it's recessive with a 0. Really, it should be a 0 because it's the lack of a protein, not a separate protein called O, right? So your blood types then that you can get from this are type A, type B, type AB, and type O. Okay? And those types come to us from the fact that you can have, to get type A, you could be IA, or you could be IA, little io. Same with B. IB, or IB little io. Okay? Type AB, though, is when you have one copy of the A producing its protein and one copy of the B producing its protein. So you'd have both protein A and protein B on the surface of your blood cells. And then type O is if you have neither. So the only way that you get type O is if you have two copies of that no protein gene. Okay? So you could ask a question like, what would be the probability that a female with type B blood reproducing with a male with type O blood produces offspring that have type O blood? And that's tough because you don't know what the genotype is for the type B. So you have to do both, right? If it's this genotype and this genotype, what's the probability that the offspring would be type O? 0%, right? They would all be heterozygotes. They would all be this at the end, right? But what about if you have this genotype and this genotype? What is it? 50%, right? So if you did the Punnett square, it would be this one and this one, this one and this one, and then this one and this one and that one and that one. So it would be 50%, right? All right. So that means that this is 2 out of 4. This is 0 out of 4, right? So a total of 2 out of 8 would have type O blood, or 25%, right? Okay. So these types of dominance are important to know because they are going to apply to all these other little intricacies that we're going to talk about, okay? So the first intricacy that we're going to look at is the same as this blood group thing. It's called multiple alleles. And basically what it means is that within a population, sometimes there are more than 2 possible genes, okay? Or 2 possible versions of a gene. Within a population, there may be more than 2 possible alleles. Okay, so let's look at something like hair color. Okay, we're going to say hair color is the gene H. Okay, and then let's say that there is people that have brown hair. And brown hair would be big H sub BR or something like that. There are people who have black hair. Big H sub BL. There are people who have blonde hair. We're going to say that's little h sub b. And people who have red hair, we're going to say that's little h sub r. Okay? So, what happens if a person inherits one allele for brown and one allele for black? What color hair do they have? Brownish black. So what type of dominance would be going on with those 2 genes? Codominance. Okay? What about if a person has one brown and one blonde? They have brown hair, right? So what type of dominance is that? Complete dominance. What about if it's blonde and red? It's light red, which is what type of incomplete dominance? What about if it is, I guess that's pretty much all of them. I guess maybe you could say, no, that's pretty much all. That's all. Okay, so it matters, and you could also say that like red is, or brown is dominant to red, but red is dominant to blonde. Yeah?
So codominance would be when there's 2 big H's would be brown and black.
Mm-hmm. And so a person with brown and black, one brown allele, one black allele has dark, very dark brown hair.
And then so complete dominance when there would be like brown and blonde because it's a big H and brown.
Yes, correct. Okay? So, next one. polygenic inheritance. Okay? Polygenic inheritance means that one phenotypic trait is controlled by multiple different genes. Okay, so let's say our example that we're going to use here is human height. And let's say, for the purpose of simplicity, that human height is controlled by 6 genes, right? It's actually way more than that. But for the purpose of us being able to do it in our notes, we'll say that it's only 6 genes that are going to control this. Let's just call those genes A, B, C, D, E, and F. And again, for the purpose of discussion, let's assume that there are only 2 possible alleles for each of these genes, a tall allele and a short allele. Again, that's disingenuous because there's probably more than that. There's probably multiple genes for each of these, or multiple alleles for each of these genes. But to keep it simple, let's say that there's something like this: big T, little t, little t, little t, big T, big T, big T, little t, little t, little t, little t, little t. So if we count here, we can see that 1, 2, 3, 4 of these alleles are for tall, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are for short. Okay? Is this person tall or short? There's really no way to tell. Okay? And the reason why there's no way to tell is because we don't know the type of dominance that exists for each one of these genes. If this is complete dominance, where the tall allele is dominant over the short allele, then this person actually has 1, 2, 3 of their genes that are saying that they're tall, and 1, 2, 3 that are saying that they're short. And so in that case, they would be medium height, right? But let's say that these are actually incompletely dominant. In that case, they would be shorter than normal because they have only 1, 2, 3, 4 tall traits or tall alleles, and they have 8 short ones. Right? So there's no real way for us to tell. However, you can stack the deck in your favor. If you take somebody who's very tall and they reproduce with another person who's very tall, right? Is there still a chance that they can have a very short offspring? Yes, but it's unlikely, right? It's relatively unlikely. So are you guys familiar with Yao Ming? Right? Yao Ming is a giant. He's an absolute ridiculous giant. And it happens to be that Yao Ming's parents were also giants. They were both professional basketball players. And not only were they professional basketball players, they were the tallest professional basketball players in the league at the time. And they were encouraged to have a son who would be a powerhouse, right? And sure enough, right, they had a son, and their son was Yao Ming. If you're unfamiliar with Yao Ming, here's Yao Ming next to a normal-sized person, right? Here's Yao Ming next to a bunch of normal-sized people, right? Yao Ming is not normal. He's massive. And the reason for that was that his parents already had their genes stacked up towards the tall ones, right? And there was just this perfect storm of events where Yao Ming happened to inherit every single tall allele there was, right? There's a little bit of math that you can go through and do this, right? He's like 8 standard deviations off of what you would expect from his parents, given of his height, given what his parents are, right? So even though his parents were both giants, the likelihood of them having somebody who was as giant as Yao Ming is still extremely small, but it happened, right? So not only was he bred essentially to be giant, but then there was this massive stroke of luck that also made him absolutely giant. There's also some hypotheses about the fact that his parents grew up in kind of poverty situations, and so it's possible that his parents have the genes to be taller, but never got taller because of malnutrition. That's another hypothesis about it.
Wait, how tall is he?
He's 7'6". But the weird thing about him is that he's 7'6", but he's big everywhere. Like, there's 7'6" people who are just tall and they look all lanky and stuff. He just looks like if you put a normal human into Photoshop and then scaled him up like 1.5%.
My dad saw him at a hotel in Houston because that's where he played.
Yeah.
He had to turn sideways
To get through a door. That doesn't even surprise me. I've heard he's just absolutely ridiculous. Like, he looks like a giant human. Like, you feel weird. Like, there could be a whole bunch of him around. Andre the Giant had a genetic disorder that caused him to get bigger, to produce growth hormone his entire life. So he wasn't necessarily supposed to be that tall. He didn't have all the genes to be that tall. He just had a disorder that made him.
How tall was he?
Andre the Giant, not that tall. I think he was like maybe 7 foot.
Not that tall.
I mean, he's not 7'6". Still half a foot shorter than yeah. Anyways, all right. So oops, we already talked about polygenic inheritance. This is a type of polygenic inheritance called epistasis. Okay, epistasis, like I said, is a type of polygenic inheritance, which means that there's going to be multiple genes controlling a trait. But in this case, one of the genes can completely override another gene. Okay, so multiple genes control a phenotype or a phenotypic trait. Whoops. But one gene overrides the rest. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but there is a very interesting instance of this happening that we see all the time if you ever work in a pet store or you like have reptiles or anything like that. If you feed the feeder rats they come in 3 colors, right? The ones that you would feed a reptile. They come in black, they come in brown, and they come in white. Okay, black rats are the dominant trait. Brown rats is a recessive trait. Okay, but sometimes when you breed a black rat with a brown rat, you get a white rat. Okay, and the reason why this happens is because they have 2 different genes, and one gene actually makes the pigment for their hair, and then they have another gene that controls whether or not that hair that they have has a location for the pigment to stick to. Okay, so if the hair that they're producing has no place for the pigment to stick, it doesn't matter what kind of pigment they produce, because the pigment will never stick and their hair will be white, right? So you can inherit black pigment, you can inherit brown pigment and still get a white rat if that white rat doesn't have the ability to attach pigment to the hair. In which case we would say the hair color is controlled by multiple genes, but the attachment pigment overrides the coloration pigment because it determines whether or not that pigment gets to attach to the hair at all. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's talk about the opposite of polygenic inheritance called plyotropy. Plyotropy means that there are multiple different traits that can be controlled by one gene. So a single gene can affect multiple phenotypic traits. Okay, so you can see this is exactly the opposite of polygenic inheritance, right? So polygenic is multiple genes. This is multiple traits by one gene. Okay, so an example of this is albinism, right? So most of us, everybody in here, from what I can tell, I'm sorry I offended anybody, but everybody produces melanin. It's a skin pigment, right? And it's a pigment that's used in skin, hair, and eyes, right? So pigment that goes to skin color, hair color, and eye color. If you do not produce this pigment, you will have characteristic skin color, hair color, and eye color because you're not producing that pigment. This one pigment, melanin, is the difference, the thing that makes people have light blonde hair versus dark blonde hair, or darker blonde or sandy blonde or whatever, right? And generally speaking, if you see somebody who has really light blonde hair, they should also have much lighter skin. And the reason for that is melanin is going into the hair and it's going into the skin, right? Whereas if you see somebody who has darker skin, they are likely to not have really light blonde hair. And if they do, it's probably because they bleached it that way, because they will have the same pigment for their skin that also gets its way into their hair, right? There's also something called the norm of reaction. Which is sometimes called multifactorial. Multifactorial inheritance, we already talked about it a little bit with, what's up?
What about people who have like really light skin but really dark hair?
That's fine because that's a different pigment. It's hair pigment that's making their hair dark, right? But if you don't produce any pigment in your hair, then you would have blonde hair, but that means that the blonde hair that's not producing any pigment is going to get some of that pigment from your skin. And so the skin pigment can cause the hair to be darker if it doesn't have a color of its own already. Yeah. All right. Multifactorial means that there is a normal range of phenotypes that you can see from a single gene based on environmental factors. Normal range of phenotypes from one allele based on environmental factors. Okay, so we talked about this briefly before with Yao Ming's parents. There are theories that Yao Ming's parents, since they grew up in poverty, that they did not have the nutrition in order to get as big as they could have gotten, right? Yao Ming, though, was two professional basketball players' son, so he was not in poverty. In fact, this was a time in China when they were trying to specifically breed athletes so that they could be in the forefront and they could be a world power in everything, right? And so, of course, he had everything available to him. He was, the most nutritious food, the best living conditions, all these things to make sure that his genes were able to grow to or cause him to grow to his full potential, right? Same thing goes like if you look at somebody like LeBron James, who's just not super giant like Yao Ming is, but he's a physical specimen. He's really, really strong, right? He's relatively big as well. Take LeBron James' genes and then just take that same baby and shut this baby in the basement and feed him only McDonald's, and you'll end up with a different looking adult, right? If you take a rose and you plant an identical rose in a garden and you plant one on the beach, both of them will grow, but they'll look very different from one another, right? One of them will have very broad leaves, one of them very thin leaves, one of them probably won't ever flower, right? And so even though the genes are exactly the same way, the environment has a fairly large role in how those genes get expressed. That's called norm of reaction. The last thing that we're going to talk about is called sex linkage. And sex linkage refers to when there is a gene that's located on the sex chromosome. Specifically, this would be on the X chromosome for humans. Specifically, the X chromosome in humans. Why do you think that that it wouldn't be located on the Y chromosome? Nope.
Not all humans have
Yeah, because not all humans have Y chromosomes, and therefore it couldn't be a trait that we see in all humans. Really, I guess if you were going to classify sex linkage as having something on the Y chromosome, you could call being male a sex-linked trait, but it's not, right? It's these genes that are located on the X chromosome. Okay, so because males only have one copy, because males are XY, not XX, right? That means males have one copy of the X chromosome. That means that there's no such thing as dominant and recessive for males if it's sex-linked, because we're only going to have one copy, no matter what. Okay. Instead of calling us homozygous or heterozygous, then we refer to males as being hemizygous for sex-linked traits. Okay, so let's look at an example of this. Red-green color blindness. I am red-green colorblind. It's very common for males to be red-green colorblind. It's also relatively common for females to be red-green colorblind, but we see it in roughly 20% more males than females. Okay? So, the question is, why does that happen? Well, if you think of red-green color blindness as having the traits either normal, so if we say N is equal to normal, or C is equal to colorblind, then we know that the female genotypes that are possible here are X normal, X normal, X normal, X colorblind, and then X colorblind, X colorblind. Okay? And so given that this is a recessive disorder, that means that the only female that would be colorblind then is this one. So that's 1/3. Right? 1/3 of females would of the female genotypes would have this disorder. Okay? But if we look at the male genotypes, males are XY, right? So that means we have X normal Y and we have X colorblind Y. Right? And so that means that 1 out of 2, or 50% of males versus the 33% of females. And as I said, we see it roughly 20% more in males than we do in females, which makes total sense based on the genotypes possible. Okay. What about sex-linked dominant disorders? Who's more likely to get a sex-linked dominant disorder? Females are, because they just only need one copy of it, right? And so that would mean that 2 out of 3 female genotypes would have that disorder, but only 1 out of 2 males would have the disorder. Questions on that? All right, that's it.